Could I describe the show in 4 words?
Brian.
Morning, Brian. How are we?
Informative.
Margaret. Margaret, how are you?
Well, Brian, always well.
Witty.
Friendship.
Sort of niche.
Politics.
What are you going to do?
4 reasons to watch the new drama. It has been fabulously well written by James Graham.
It's about a friendship, an intense friendship.
Brilliantly directed by Steven Frears.
A friendship that grows stronger and then falls apart in either an act of betrayal or an act of principle, depending on your point of view.
Wonderfully acted by Steve Coogan. Moderately well acted by Harriet Walter.
Rob Burley wrote a book called Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me? I said, I think this is a good story. And he said, I think you should play Brian Walden. I then asked James Graham, the esteemed political playwright, writer of Sherwood, and someone I had huge respect for. I said, how do you fancy writing about these 2 people?
And I was extremely surprised when my agent said, there is this thing afoot, and it's about Brian Walden and Margaret Thatcher. And I do remember Brian Walden quite well. And I was very surprised that I'd been asked because I didn't see any association with her. But it was fairly irresistible to follow along with it because of its credentials with Steve Coogan and James Graham.
I found playing Brian Walden, for me, I found fairly comfortable, I would say. All parts were a challenge, but I found it quite comfortable because I identified with Brian. The thing that made Brian Walden and Margaret Thatcher attracted to each other is they saw themselves as outsiders. When I say outsiders, I mean outsiders of the traditional classical tradition of people in power these days. They tend to all be privately educated. They all went to Oxbridge. They're all part of a sort of a club, if you like. So I knew I could do his voice, or an approximation of his voice. So for me, it was, I enjoyed it. It felt right to me. I was like, okay, as long as we get the right Margaret Thatcher, then we'll be off and running.
I watched other people's performances that I had already seen. I'd seen Meryl Streep in the movie The Iron Lady. I'd seen Gillian Anderson in The Crown. That lineup alone is very, very daunting. And I decided I don't look anything like her. I'm probably the first brown-eyed, dark-haired person who's taken on the role. And I asked for a lot of help with, the makeup and hair and voice lessons and things like that to go what I thought was a very long journey. And that all fed into deciding that I'm not going to try and compete with those brilliant people. I'm going to just tell a different story about her that nobody else has quite told and try and get under her skin.
When I was preparing the role, of course, I went back and used all the interviews that Brian Walden had done, especially the ones with Margaret Thatcher. He interviewed Margaret Thatcher a dozen times. But also, I'm old enough to remember the original interviews on television. In fact, I would watch him regularly on television on a Sunday. He had a colloquial approach to interview people. There was something gritty and earthy. He used common or garden phrases when he was talking to politicians, and that made it more immediate and accessible to ordinary people, and that's right up my street. So I got him.
Very good, nicely pitched.
I had to look at a lot of YouTube films and documentaries about Margaret. There were 2 things. One was that there are some scenes in the films that are documented on YouTube, so anybody can compare my performance with the real thing. And then the other side of the research was I looked into anything I could find that was more personal when she was talking about worries about her looks, about her hair, about her skin, about how she wore pearls because it lightened her face, and how she wore big bows because she wanted to soften her image and things like that. I thought that was all quite interesting because you never get a male politician talking in those terms. I did discover a bit of sort of lightness of touch, a bit more wit, a bit more candour in the way she spoke.
Story's relevant in 2 ways. Well, first of all, it's about friendship, and that never goes. Stories about friendship are perennial. They don't date. It's about the accountability in politics, and what was unique about Brian Walden was that he and the politicians he interviewed was that they subject themselves to 45, 50 minutes of intense scrutiny and cross-examination. And no politician does that anymore.
the interaction between the press, the media, and the political party has changed so much since the Brian Walden, Margaret Thatcher interview that we see. I find that this film sort of provokes anybody watching to think, gosh, those were the days when you could actually sit down across from a politician and have quite a high level of debate and make them say what they really were intending.
Are you to blame?
People are frightened of saying what they really feel now. And I think the public are fed up with it because they see through it, so they lose respect for politics and politicians.
Be authentic and spontaneous, and also say what you believe in.
Working opposite Steve Coogan is surprising because I thought it would be a laugh a minute and we'd all be rolling in the aisles and he'd be doing some impersonation. He takes his work very seriously, and the results you can see on the screen are amazing.
Of course, I was delighted when Harriet Walter agreed to play Margaret Thatcher. She too, like me, I think had a natural antipathy towards Margaret Thatcher and her legacy. But she also, like me, found her fascinating. And so, and that friendship. So I think we both were coming at it from similar angles. I don't know quite what her process was, but what I really loved about what she did was that she didn't just do an impersonation. She sort of got under the skin and I think illuminated something that we haven't seen before about Margaret Thatcher. That's what was exciting about her performance.
I enjoyed that. I don't know why some people fear this whole, the medium. I see these conversations as opportunities.
But what I did find in doing it, I kept seeing things from her point of view as a woman surrounded by men. And that coloured, it was my way into her. It was my way into empathizing with her. It was my way into understanding her, was being a woman in that situation. And everything about her rigidity and her personality, or her public persona, was about trying to prove to the boys that she could be as tough as them.
It was a very fractious time, but it was an exciting time, whichever side of the fence you were on. It was dynamic, things were happening in politics, and the idea of change and the whiff of radical change being possible was in the air, and there were clear choices.
Steven Frears is somebody who, if you look him up, you will see that some of your favourite films were directed by Steven Frears over the last 4 decades. And I had been aware of him since, I think probably My Beautiful Laundrette was the first time I'd heard of him. And his variety, the variety of what he does is something that is right up my street, because I try and do that myself. You go from a modern comedy to a classic tragedy to something set in a foreign country to something set in your own street. You have big stars and no stars, and there's just this huge range of what he's interested in.
Call Brian.
He's a master of his craft. He's been doing it for years. He is a sort of a living legend as a director. He's a very safe pair of hands. He sort of feels his way through a story. He's not an auteur by his own admission. He's a director who, often a list of unsung directors, I've put him in the same category as people like Sidney Lumet and Alan J. Pakula, Sidney Pollack, these people who, George Roy Hill, these film directors who they just wanted to tell the story rather than put their own particular imprint on a story.
Bernard, should that go, that ornament thing? It looks as if it's sticking out of my head. I don't want people to think I've been impaled.
Well, take a look at me, and I do not look very like Margaret Thatcher. I asked for this fairly early on because I thought I just need to believe I could vaguely look like her before I could even start. So we had a brilliant wig department, and we had sort of 3 different blonde wigs that were sort of slightly aged at different times of her life. We had a much more peaches and cream complexion. I had blue eyes for when I was younger, blue-grey eyes for when I was older, all these details. I had a fake set of teeth, Maid, which apparently Meryl Streep did as well, and probably Gillian Anderson did. And you'd think, well, might she not? Are they that different? She had a slight overbite, and it slightly influenced the way I spoke. I have to say that in my costume, I had a fuller breast, sort of rather padded out bra and broader shoulders and things like that. And then I basically watched her a lot and watched her movements and watched her mannerisms. And what was very, very difficult to achieve was that, first of all, I'm very animated and she's quite mask-like in many ways. So I had to really control that. And also, what I found with her was her eyes were sort of downward, sort of, she would smile with her mouth and not smile with her eyes. And I absolutely couldn't do that. I tried, but I watched back some of it and my eyes are smiling. I thought, I don't remember seeing much of her eyes smiling. It's difficult things like that.
Harriet Walter obviously had a lot of makeup and hair and all this for Margaret Thatcher, but to play Brian Walden, I just dyed my hair and put a suit on and get it cut in a certain way. I've got an aversion to have anything done to my nose. I've got this idea that if you put anything on your nose, it distracts people. Even if they go, wow, that nose looks nothing like Steve Coogan's nose. I don't know. I mean, or whomever's nose. What did my preparation for Brian Walden? What, I cut my hair, I dyed it. Nothing really. I just put on, I adopted his manner of talking. I didn't want it to be an impersonation, so I could probably do a more forensically accurate impersonation of Brian Walden if I put my mind to it, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted a sort of a flavor to capture the flavour of him, which is sort of matching what Harriet was doing. If it's two people trying to see who can do the best impersonation of Margaret Thatcher and Brian Walden, it sort of falls apart. It's not what it's about. It's about finding the sort of what makes that person tick, and sort of having an element of his voice. He couldn't fully pronounce his R's, so there was sort of he pronounced them like that. And the way he spoke had a sort of Midlands burr to it, and a certain technique. And I did that insofar as it helps you. Sometimes those physical tics and elements help you find out who that person is.
Someone will come for me.
I reckon there's no one you won't be able to see off, Mug.